Okay, what's up, everybody? So, welcome to People Who Teach, a podcast dedicated to the habits, routines, and influences that push today's teachers, creators, and thinkers. Today's conversation is with Adam Kreutinger, who is all of those things. And this is a part 2. So, I'm excited to dig right in with Adam, and I'll get us started. Let's welcome Adam Kreutinger.
Hey,
Adam, welcome.
how's it going, my man?
I am doing all right. So you're on the podcast for People Who Teach, and we are here to basically unpack a part 2 with you. And I will put the link to our first conversation when the pandemic started, and I'll put a link to that here at the end of this show. But just for people who are getting to know who you are, and on this show, we talk about the habits, routines, and influences of people who teach. Obviously, that's one part of who you are. But just give us a little bit of background about what you do, where you are. You are pretty much everywhere. So,
yeah. I'm a full-time art teacher at elementary school where I work with you in Orchard Park, and it's great. I've always loved art my whole life. I've always done it, and I'm an artist outside of that as well. And my main art is my puppetry. And yeah, I've been doing puppetry, building puppets, doing puppet shows and stuff for about 10 years or so. And other than that, a family man too. I just had a daughter this past year, and just living life.
Yeah. So and congratulations. That is a big step. And wait until your daughter is crawling. Life will change forever.
Oh, she just started crawling, and it has changed. It's quite a difference.
Everything you know before this was easy. So, I wanted to kick off the podcast today with a big part of what I think when I think of you. Okay, I think of a person who wears many hats. Yes, of course, we've got the obvious one, which is the teacher, and we've got the easy ones to find, like your puppetry. You're also a podcast host. You are a former, maybe still dabbling magician.
I work full time though. Yeah.
Right. And if I had to classify you in sort of one broad stroke, I would say you're a creator, right? You create a ton of content. You have put that content out there. So one of the things that I just wanted to get started with was when you go to create anything, whether it's a new show or a podcast, me creating this show, there's some trepidation, and I need somebody like an entry point or a way in. What are the sort of like channels or pathways that you go through when you're creating anything either new for the first time or creating something that might be a little bit challenging? What's your process? What do you go through?
You know what? I think it's almost an anti-process where I just I have an idea and I don't wait. I don't wait for any permission. I just do it. It's something that me and you have talked about in the past about things where I don't remember how you phrase it, but like the more ideas you let out, the more that you can also let in. You're almost like giving your brain or your creative essence room to breathe by letting things out as well. So that's what I do, because I feel like you can plan for something, but you're always going to have unforeseen obstacles. And I just I like jumping into things because I think that's how you learn. That's how I just learn everything. I'm very hands-on, and I'm very hands-on in things that don't look as hands-on as well. I just jump in kind of whether or not I'm ready. Luckily I have enough experiences where I think I'm pretty competent in most things. I've been editing videos, so I'm just familiar with how video and stuff works already. And I do a test or two, but I don't wait. I just jump in.
And where do you think that started? I mean, I think so let me compare this to sort of my experience to this point, which is, for me, the idea of creating as an educator is one thing, but creating outside of education is very new for me. And I think it's new for a lot of people. And people are finding ways to get after it a little bit. Yeah. But was there a moment for you where you're like, man, once I created that thing and I shipped it and I pushed it out, I realized there's more to come? Was there a defining moment for you?
No, not really. It's kind of things that I've always done my whole life. I think what I do is I kind of see something that someone else does, and I get inspired by that. It's like, oh, that looks cool. I want to do that, but in my own way. Kind of like, I see someone else. I saw my first video podcast. It's like, that looks cool. I could maybe do that with something that I love too. Let me try that. And same thing with a puppet. Like I see a really cool, interesting design. I don't copy that puppet because I was like, oh, like maybe what if I did a puppet that big or that small or that works that way, but is my own twist on it, And same thing with art. That's all art is in so many ways. A lesson that I want to do with the kids soon, hopefully this week actually, is one of my favorite artists is a newer artist that I've seen. He's a contemporary artist, Callan Schaub, who has this, I may have showed it to you, this big like bike contraption sitting on its side so he can spin the canvas.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Paint at it.
Yeah.
And actually, I wanted to do it at the art festival at South Davis this year. And I have
we were going to film it, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I have an old exercise bike in the back of my room that I was going to, turn into this art contraption. But, of course, it's not happening in that way this year. But I still wanted to introduce the kids to him. Mm-hmm. So I'm coming up with another kind of DIY way to do it small by yourself at home, just using cardboard and relatively common, at least art materials.
Mm-hmm. So. That's so fascinating that you're willing to kind of go that direction and share that with kids. I'm going to circle back to the podcast piece in a minute, but I just want to jump on the puppetry. For those who don't know you've been making puppets for how long now?
Probably about 10 years.
Okay. So 10 years you've been at making puppets. And to be honest with you, you've cultivated such a community of people who follow you, not only on your YouTube channel, which I'm sure we'll highlight before the episode's over, but in your Facebook community, on your podcast. You have quite the following of people who are interested in the craft. And I heard you describe in another podcast, one I believe you did with, I'm drawing a blank. I'll have to figure out exactly who it is.
Disney one?
It was a Disney one. Yeah, there you go.
Dreamfinder.
Dreamfinder. Thank you. Excellent podcast, by the way. But one of the things I heard you say in there was your design process for making puppets is pretty unique. You start off, I believe you start off with clay. I just wondered if you could walk us through sort of your, like, how you come to see a product. And I'm going to pull up one that you just recently did. And I'd love for you to walk us through your most recent, I believe it's your most recent creation. I'm going to pull it up on the screen here now. And I'm just wondering if you could just kind of walk us through your,
Sure.
And I'm sharing your Instagram right now.
Okay.
So you've just recently created the Yoda.
Oh yeah.
The baby Yoda. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And if you take a look at some of these, I mean, how do you get to this stage of creation and development here from basically nothing? Now I know that there's some experience here, but like, where does it start for you?
Yeah, well, for something like this puppet, this is the most mechanical puppet that I've built. Most of them I start with like you said, I start with clay to get the forms, which tell me what shape the foam needs to be manipulated in. This one didn't start this way. This one is all mechanical stuff underneath. And so I did kind of plan it out in my head a little bit. But it's funny, and actually, if you look a little further down, there should be a mechanical drawing of what it was supposed to look like that I did in on my iPad and posted. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, with a puppet like that, like it's just so different because all these, there it is, yeah. So it's one thing that I've put all these mechanisms in single puppets before, but I've never put all these mechanisms into one puppet. And that was the biggest obstacle in this one, is making all these different movements, because he has an ear movement and an eye blink and mouth talking mechanism, and having all these work together and not get in each other's way because there's hinges and pulleys and different types of things going on. So with that one, I did do this design process, but one thing I always say to my buddy too, you can only design, at least me personally, I can only design so much on paper, because on paper, there's no gravity, there's no friction, everything works perfect. And when you plan it out in your head, and sometimes even when you draw it on paper, But once you start getting those materials in your hand, you're like, oh, okay, oh, the weight of this is influencing this in a way I didn't expect with the movement. So, but it's just putting all those things. The main thing with a puppet like that is having some sort of housing. So there's a plate in the bottom, a wooden plate, and then that quote unquote skull, which is just that slice out of the PVC pipe. And that's what houses all the mechanics. And it protects them from if this thing is bumped. And also it gives me a surface to attach all the foam to, which is what you see there. That is the carved foam and covered in the fleece there. And again, it's just, and I'm using techniques that I don't use that often in this puppet, which is what I try to do with all my builds. Is try to choose designs that'll help me grow as a builder, and like all that detail in the forehead with all those
his abs.
His the abs that Yoda has on the top of his head.
Sure.
Is a type of technique that I don't use that often. And it was fun to do an experiment and to see if I can do it, and it worked. So that's something I could probably do a future build as well. And I mean, actually, he's not done yet. I haven't touched him the last couple of weeks. I've been so focused on my virtual classroom, but I'm hoping to actually finish him hopefully next week, and then can get that out there, because it's going to be like 150 hours worth of video footage, because I filmed the entire making of it, but I'm going to edit that down into hopefully a 10 to 15 minute time lapse that'll go on my YouTube channel for people to watch.
Well, I guess that's the most interesting thing to me. You know, when I think about what this show is, and it's a show for people who teach, and you go through this design process with a craft that you have been at for a while. So I guess my question to you is, and I'm going to bring this up when it comes to the podcast as well, or creating content for YouTube, is what's the parallel between that process and what does it mean to teach and teach well? And just for context, you teach in a K-5 setting. You teach across a couple of different buildings, and you're teaching art. So what is the benefit to, or the overlap between creating puppetry and teaching in front of kids?
When you say creating puppetry, you mean specifically my YouTube content?
No, I think creating the content of actual puppetry, that craft itself. I think the YouTube content is a separate conversation, along with the podcast creations that you have in the media. But I think when it comes to the design element of puppetry, what's the parallel between that and your influences for teaching?
Sure. And I think there's two ways to approach that. One is from a standpoint of the building process, which I would equate to the art making process in the classroom for me. And also, if you take it from a performance standpoint of performing puppetry, and essentially performing a lesson, which is in a lot of ways, it kind of is a performance, right? So to start with the art making process, and in the puppet making process, and that's, I think, the biggest comparison is that it is a process. You start with materials, and then you end up with a finished product. And I think in context of teaching kids, you know, there's so many different projects we do, so many different mediums, so many different artists we talk about from history, that, you know, the content itself of the lesson is kind of secondary to just showing them how to go through a process. And that's what every single lesson is. It's how to do this process using these different materials, and also calling back to old lessons that were similar to this process. And I think, and again, I think that's one of the values in art, because at the end of the day, I know I'm not teaching each kid how to be, you know, the amount of kids in my class that are going to be professional artists when they grow up, I know is very low. I'm trying to teach them how to be art appreciators, as well as teaching them how to think critically and creatively, because I think that's the most valuable thing I can give them as students, because especially going into the future, you know, in 15 years or so, when these kids are going for jobs, their professional career jobs, their jobs probably don't even exist yet. What am I teaching them to do for their job? The only thing that I know will have value in 15, 20 years from now is creativity. So I'm teaching them the creative process and how to implement that in a project, which is the most valuable thing I think to anybody. That's what all employers look for. They look for creativity.
100%. And I'm so glad you said that, because the way that you describe the two different types of builds that you kind of funnel towards, right? Like this mechanical build, which felt newer to you, and you're sort of starting with clay. Hopefully I have these things right, but starting with clay and sort of
Yeah, the clay is never part of the puppet. Just to be clear for people listening, it's just
right,
part of the pattern making process.
right. When you're setting out to design from nothing,
Yeah.
there's one process of starting with clay and getting to the pattern, and then there's the mechanical side. Both of those required two different sort of ways of thinking to start. One was a little bit more critical thinking. One was a little bit more creative thinking. I mean, they both have overlap for sure. But what you're suggesting here when it comes to teaching is, how do I open up the pathways for kids to both think flexibly around creativity and thinking critically at the same time? And to which you bring up your point is, this is going to serve them better than me teaching them historical art content per se.
Well, another thing I just want to add into that too is, which may be a little controversial amongst other art teachers, is that I really don't focus on the product that we're making that much. Like I tell kids that, the goal of the art class is not to make a pretty piece of art. The goal of art class is to learn something in that process. And if we make a beautiful piece of art, that's a bonus, And if it doesn't come out the way you want, hopefully you learn something in that process. So if you want to take what you learn and do it again when you get home, you probably won't make that mistake again. So it's more about like that learning process than it is making stuff ready for the fridge.
Yeah. And I think more educators are getting there when it comes to that. But I think the easy out a lot of times, and especially in my work, when it comes to process versus product, you have to have an emphasis on both at some point. And what I will say is, I'll liken this to the writing process, which again is another performance art, right? You're talking about art and design in a traditional art class, and I'm talking about performance art or the humanities as it pertains to something like writing. And when it comes to that process, I really want kids to be better when they're just sort of dumping ideas onto the page, playing with words, and being flexible around perhaps a word choice or tone, or can they implement something from a writerly craft around flashback or metaphor and use that. And that requires a deep level of sort of plug and play. Like, I'm going to try this one out, didn't sound right, let's go back, let's redesign that, let's put another element in there. And that's kind of what you're describing when it comes to art education also, is being flexible around the design and in the process over the product. And that's a it's a really great takeaway.
And it's also, I think it's extra important in art because so often kids, I shouldn't say so often, once in a while you have that kid who is not happy with their art and they're sad at the end of class because like, oh, mine doesn't look like yours. And it's not supposed to, which is what I tell them. And I'd say that's one of the hardest things to get a kid to realize, that really doesn't matter. Because also, I think sometimes when they hear the teacher say like, oh, it's okay, you did yours your way, or yours looks different, in the same way that all people, we have similar features. We all have eyes, nose, this, but we all look different. And I think they just think that we're pandering to them and trying to make them just feel better rather than literally telling them the truth, and where the value is in what they did.
That's great. That's a really great way to sort of build kids up around the skills that are necessary going forward. Which brings me to another point. So another creative outlet that you have is you're on quite a bit of podcasts. And I'm just going to put a little plug in here for myself in starting this particular podcast, and even having the courage to go ahead with guests or talking about educational topics or people who teach. And, I had to be pushed a little bit by you. And I'm glad I did, because I think it's a creative outlet. But there are a ton of teachers out there who are wondering, where do you find the time for these podcasts? How do you carve it out? Do you schedule it? Can you just take us through sort of the podcasts that you're affiliated with creatively, And then also, can you just walk us through your approach to podcasting as a creative pursuit, and how that goes for you?
Sure. I anything I do is just because I want to. Like when I came up with the idea for the Puppeteers podcast, TEARS, it was just out of like I wanted to talk to other puppeteers who are my friends, and I needed an excuse to do it. And I figured if I got value out of the conversation, other people might too.
Hmm.
And then it kind of turned into documenting, history of puppetry. Obviously not complete puppetry, but at least the people that we're talking to. And it's been a lot of fun, and it has evolved itself from a technology standpoint as well as a structure standpoint for that show. And that one works a little differently because I do have a co-host for that one, and I think we delegate the work pretty well. Whereas the scheduling and stuff that you mentioned, that's all handled by my co-host. And I did, at least in the beginning too, I did most of the editing and most of that sort of technical legwork. So, but just recently, just a couple weeks ago, I started a new video cast that I'm doing called Maker Chat Live.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do that just to start to be able to talk to more creative people, because we're always talking puppeteers, which is great, which is my main thing. And if I had to do one, it would probably just be that. But I just wanted to be able to talk to more people, because especially with something like puppetry, it uses so many different trades to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
from sewing, woodworking techniques, leather techniques, 3D printing, modeling, uses a little bit of everything. So I figured it'd be fun to talk to other makers as well. So maybe I can learn something and apply it to my puppetry, or people, if they bothered to listen, might, just, it's fun being a fly in the wall. And that's the way I like to approach my shows as well, which isn't for everybody. Is I don't think they're overly structured, which again, some people might not like that. I like to keep them very conversational. And I think you're more likely to find surprises in that way.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. In launching this, I really had to sit down and, of course, I wrote it on a Post-it note, which is nearby. And I had to write down what's the purpose for this. And the real purpose is I'm just really curious to know, what are the teachers and creators and thinkers out there? Where are they getting their influences? Where are they honing their craft? How are they developing habits around their practice? Where are they pushing themselves? And I just became really curious about that. And I think this is just one of those platforms for me that I just want to talk to as many educators as I can. And I normally do. I'm talking to a ton of educators globally in some ways, but most across the country, whether it's via Twitter or sort of the PLCs that I'm involved
I
with.
wanted to say one thing though. I'm sure you've had many conversations with some of these people that were not recorded.
Yes.
And then you probably walk away from a conversation and think, my gosh, that if other people heard that, they would have got a lot of value out of that.
Yeah. And that's it. Like, I think about our conversation sometimes when we had a spare, 15 minutes in the morning before the day started. They're powerful, on topic, on brand kind of conversations about thinking, learning, designing, creating. And it wasn't until I started documenting my process for things. I think sometimes when you think of a creator, it's kind of goes back to what you said earlier when you talk about art for kids. If you just focus on the process, worry less about the followers, worry less about the audience that you don't have right now, which I don't, and focus more on me coming to this conversation and learning as much as I possibly can from the conversation. And perhaps there's more people out there like me and you who want to hear this type of content and are like, wait a second, that is exactly the same situation that I'm in. Those are my people. And I want to be a part of that conversation too. Yeah. So it really is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about,
it goes back to you just have to start anyway. Like I said in the beginning, kind of jump in whether or not you think you're ready, because that's where you'll learn the most. That the Puppeteers podcast almost didn't happen because me and Cameron couldn't agree on a name.
Okay.
And I said, well, let's just start with this, with some other name. I wanted to call at first. My idea was calling it iFocus, because iFocus is what they call where a puppet's looking. And I
Okay.
thought it was just a decent name that also could mean something else in context of a conversation. I said, well, let's just start with that. And if we have to change the name, we change the name. And he was just like dead set, like, no, like we're not changing. Like we have to know what the show's going to be and whatnot. And it's like, I would rather, you can always change. It's not ideal. I would never say that it's ideal to change your title halfway through, but don't do anything that's going to prevent you from stopping. If you're stuck on a name and you don't want to start because you don't know what the title is going to be of your book, or you don't know what the title is going to be of your podcast, just start anyway. Just call it your name. Call it the Brian Pepe Show,
Right.
or Brian Pepe Live, or whatever.
Yeah.
Then it'll evolve into something. And again, even it happens with a lot of shows too. People start off with the show being one thing, and even they even brand it that way with the name, and then it ends up being something completely different.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up too, because this almost didn't start. And as you know, I think for me, I think I'm less focused on the post-production of things, and I just want to have those real conversations. So, we found a platform that works for me, and I think you're right. I think just jumping in is something that I had to build up the courage for and see sort of the forest through the trees a bit, and that's not an easy place to be at first. And like you said, if I didn't just start tonight on this particular platform and going live on YouTube, I don't know that I would have started. This will
not only
arguably
that, too, this journey that you've been on this past year of getting to this moment right now, that's a journey that almost every single teacher in the world is starting now. A year ago, you started with getting comfortable being on camera. And that's something that a lot of teachers didn't sign up for.
Right.
And that's what they're having to do now is these Zoom or Google Hangout or Google Meets meetings, and they have to be on camera. And they, again, like I said, that's not what they signed up for. But I think in your journey over this past year, you could say to them, like, it becomes second nature. You don't think about it. In the same way that, a lot of people, like one of the biggest fears most people have in the world is standing up in front of a crowd, in front of a group, which is what we do as educators every single day.
Yeah.
And you don't think anything about it anymore,
Right.
And it's the same thing with technology.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny how that works, because like you said, it's just a matter of starting this episode. And maybe the few episodes before this that I've had on Instagram Live are arguably going to be in the body of work, probably some of my worst episodes, right? Like I will
Proud
hopefully
to be part of it.
Proud to be a part of my growth.
Yeah.
Because I think, I'm going to tee this one up in just a minute for you, but you have to go through it, and but that basically means in order to go through it, you have to start.
Yeah.
And when you are using barriers to entry to block you starting, that really is the downfall right there. And it took me some time and some convincing, which is where I want to go now. So when I think back to our relationship, and for those who don't know, I was a little hesitant to start putting anything on my YouTube channel for fear of what could I possibly have to offer others in their sort of world. And you kind of helped me phrase it in a different way, which stems from a mentor that we both have in Gary Vee, which is basically, listen, if you documented 2 things a day, okay, it would be better in the creative process than worried about a polished video with thumbnails. And I was like, all right, let's hold on. What am I going to document? And you were like, well, what are you doing after work? And I'm like, I'm probably going to go take a run. And they were like, what are you running for? And I'm running for a marathon in May. And you were like, document every day. Every day is basically was my response. But I consider that a big influence in my development, because maybe you see yourself like this and maybe you don't, but I consider you much like a coach. So what was it like for you to coach me through the process and others, because you have some other friends that you are also coaching through these processes. What is it that you see in the people you're coaching? And what is it that your coachees are not seeing in themselves?
Oh, interesting. I think, I think that part of what pushes me to do that, because I do that, I coach a lot of people
Hmm.
actually
Hmm.
on content creation, and it's something I really enjoy and want to do more of. But I think part of what I get out of it too is it motivates me to do more myself. It's kind of like is it the saying of like, do as I say, not as I do. And by telling other people what they should do, in a lot of ways, I'm also trying to remind myself.
Hmm.
It's like, yeah, that works. Why aren't you doing it too?
Hmm.
So I use it as a constant check in on myself to hold myself accountable to doing it as well.
Hmm.
That if I'm going to tell other people to do it, I need to do it myself too, uh, while still understanding that people have a slightly different process sometime, because sometimes the same advice needs to be interpreted in a different way based on what they're trying to do and what
Hmm.
platforms they're using.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, that would. I mean, what was I'm sorry. What was the second part of that?
Yeah, and then what is it like, for somebody like me who sort of latched onto the idea after a few um, sessions with you, and you convinced me, you're like, look, you are, because I came to you early on and I said, hey, listen, I don't have the right camera, and you're like, what are you holding in your pocket?
Yeah.
um, listen, audio is going to be a disaster, and you're like, nobody's watching. This has nothing to do with anybody watching right away.
Yeah.
This is about just adding some value, and so I'll sort of
Well,
walk people through.
because you mentioned the documenting too, because I think what you said was true
Mhm.
about documenting. But when I tell people to document, it is partially for that reason. But for me, it's more so about what I said before about just getting comfortable
Mhm.
being on camera. And someone's not so much comfortable being on camera as it is comfortable watching yourself back. 'Cause I think
Mhm.
that's the hardest thing for most people in the beginning as well. It's like, "Ooh, do I sound like that? Ooh, you notice a lot of your own, not flaws, but quirks, things that you say a lot that you, didn't realize that you say all the time, And again, it's something that valuable that some teachers have used as a tool is recording yourself on a lesson and watching it back. You'll learn more about yourself as a teacher than any possible way in the world if you film a whole lesson and watch it back. It'll be hard to watch probably.
Yeah.
You'll realize, wow, do I really say that often? Or wow, like doing it this way if I just did this, it would have been so much more effective. But you
Mhm.
don't notice that until you have the outside perspective, which is why and again, and like you said, some people don't know where to start with what to film. So then document is just like,
Right.
yeah, you don't have to think about it as much.
Yeah, and I think that was the thing, is like not thinking about post production. And you're absolutely right. Up when it comes to lessons, you can catch everything, but I also think it's important when we talk about people who teach and they're recording their lessons or they're watching them back, when you're watching it back for growth and goal setting, which is one thing that I highly encourage, and I think we've gotten more people accustomed to doing. And I've recorded a lot of my conversations with teams and or my team of instructional coaches. You do pick up on nuances, but it's important not to dwell on the nuances that really aren't affecting your style of communication, or they're not affecting
Mm.
the value that you bring to the table. Like, I watched a lot of mine back, and whether it was the running videos that I did, or I watched some of these team meetings back, or some of my coaching interactions, and I use the word
Mm.
so one of the things and I do a lot of that often, but if I dwell on that thing and try to change that one thing, like a word, then I might miss some of the value that I could have added to teachers or colleagues or creators in a different way. And what I found through some of the feedback on my own channel and colleagues that have watched it back with me is that a lot of times it is about the content that I'm putting out there was helpful. It was helpful in either demystifying something for somebody else, clarifying something for somebody else, or um, other colleagues were on about a certain thing, and this just sits really nicely with what they were thinking anyhow. So it sort of pushes them. So I do think it varies depending on.
Yeah, and I agree with you
Yeah.
100% in that, like, yeah, don't get too caught up in the weeds of
Hmm.
something like that, which I think is kind of what you're saying. But one thing I'd say, even though I do agree with that, one thing I'd also say to kind of counterpoint that is like, when you're trying to teach something, you want to be as effective as possible. And maybe there is a better phrase, or if you do cut that out less, that would make you more effective.
Mhm.
And actually, going back a little bit to how that can apply to in the classroom, in the same way I was saying, like the way I design a puppet show or a magic show or even a YouTube video, is what you're really trying to do in something like that is grab people's attention.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's what we're trying to do with our students as well. If we don't have their attention, we have nothing, because that's why, for my graduate program in art education, my project was I was creating a pilot for a children's television show using puppetry that taught art education. And the thing that I was discovering is, and it sounds strange to say as a teacher and as an educator, but the entertainment was more important than the education. Again, which sounds backward to most teachers probably, but the reason why is because you need their attention first, and you get that with the entertainment, and then you can teach them anything.
Mhm.
If you just focus on the education and you didn't grab their attention with the entertainment, you're kind of wasting your time. Okay. And that's in a lot of ways how I apply my teaching as well, because I'm pretty goofy in the classroom too. And in a way, kids, I think part of the excitement that they might have in coming to me beyond the hands-on medium is knowing that they don't know quite what to expect, which
Mm.
also sounds backward to most teaching, because kids like routine, they like being comfortable, they like knowing what to expect.
Mhm.
But I think in art and in creativity, um, I think they're getting more out of it if they don't. From a learning creativity standpoint, is yeah, it's hard to
Yeah.
explain.
Well, that's interesting because that tees up a question for me that I had, and I know you have, and you could just touch on this briefly, which is I know you have a background in magic as well, and I mentioned that at the outset. There was a time when I was a novice sixth grade teacher, and I realized that getting the attention and having the hook into the lesson was just as important as the content I was trying to have kids interact with. And it was really a challenge because I couldn't find the ways. And the easiest platform to me, it was a fascination that I've always had, which is magic. Now, I've never practiced magic. I know enough to find a few tricks here and there and try to do my best to engage an audience of kids. And but I've always been fascinated by it because it's always been the hook where I've paid attention probably the most. And I used it as a way to get kids' attention. And then there was sort of a sharp detour towards the content, but kids were arguably with me at that point. Have you ever tried using magic or elements of magic in the classroom? And I'm not saying, hey, go out, teachers, and buy a magic trick or anything like that, but I'm saying, like, what are the elements of magic that make it possible to engage kids?
Yeah, I have used magic. I've actually found puppetry to be more successful in doing that, because there's something about magic where you don't know how it's done, which
Mm.
can be distracting for a long time, because
That's a great point.
they can be thinking about how it's done the whole time. Whereas
Mm.
when I do something with a puppet, they're entertained by it, but there's no secret. They just know it's Mr.
Right.
Kreutinger doing a puppet, and
Yeah.
it was goofy and it was
Point.
funny. So I've actually had a little, again, not always.
Yeah.
Is if it's at the end of the, well, that's why I kind of stopped doing it. 'Cause I found out if I do it in the beginning to try to get their attention, they're just distracted the whole time because
Right.
they're trying to think
Right.
about how it worked. And if I do it at the end, it's better, but it's probably not as good for the teacher that picks
Teacher
it
will
up.
pick 'em up.
Yeah. So I do, I in school I more so use the magic for a special occasion.
Okay. Okay.
At my first school, I always did a show. I did the kindergarten bash at the end of the year, like their graduation. Every year I did that. I didn't do a full school show every single year, because to be honest, like again, I'm not full time with it anymore. I don't develop new work in magic that much anymore.
Yeah.
So I don't have 6 shows to rotate every year for everyone. So it was nice doing it just for the kindergarten, because I can kind of do my one main fun show that I do every year. Those kids get to experience it, and then
Good point.
it was that.
So this brings me to like the next point of when it comes to creativity in the classroom. If you had, I was just on a call a little while ago with new teachers who are entering the field. Now, these are general education teachers entering the field. They just graduated from a local university here. I served as a mentor and instructional coach for them and the schools that they were going through their residency with. This is the year-long residency that they had. And I had some words of wisdom for them. And part of the words of wisdom that I offered them was to document as much as they possibly could early, right? And not for the purpose of publishing it per se, but for the purpose of collecting it along the way, so that you have this body of work to look back on and can appreciate the growth that you've experienced, and probably be able to speak and tell stories in a few years that can speak back to that process and how you got to the place where you are. So that was my big sort of message to them. But I'm wondering, what would be your big message if you had them captive and you could talk to any new educator? Entering at a time like this is tricky, but what would be your words of wisdom to a group of educators entering the field?
Actually, I just did that too. And do you mind if I make it specific to now?
No, go ahead. Absolutely.
Because I was contacted by Buffalo State, where my professor at Buffalo State from when I went to graduate school there, and she said, I have my student teachers, and they did their first placement, and they can't do their second placement, and I'm still and the professor was teaching them digitally, which I'm sure she had done digital classes before, but not student teaching classes with their students digitally, which is a whole new thing. So she wanted to have them talk to other art teachers. And she's like, I want you to talk to them about, doing applications a little bit, about engaging students in the art class, how you do that, all that different stuff. And we talked for like an hour or so. But the thing that I opened and closed with that I told them is, I said, with what's going on right now with this, I said, this is really hard right now to be a teacher in this time. But as a student teacher, there's a way for you to turn this into an experience that you can talk about in an interview and to make you sellable to, in an interview. I said, you taught during the pandemic. I'm like, there could be a lot of power to that too. So sure, you can't do your second placement in the way you expected to. But I'm sure if you talk to your cooperating teacher, if you do some video lessons and send it to them and say, hey, share these with your student, feel free to share these with your students, that I'm sure that teacher would jump on it. Because again, everyone's kind of thrown in this. Everyone's looking for ideas and content. And then you could have gotten some teacher products or some student products out of that too. And then you could, turn that into such a positive thing for your portfolio. And saying like, look what I did in one of the hardest times and unexpected times as a student teacher, and how I was able to pivot and look at the student work I was able to get out of that. Because especially we're going into a world, and we were talking about this, privately the other day, is education could be very different from now on. It could be kind of a gradual change. It could be a really, really quick change, but it's going to happen, and it's going to be closer to what's happening now than what was happening 3 months ago, and again, there's no, my main point in that too, this might still sound a little strange, but I guess my point was the fact that this happened during their student teaching is not something that the kids who graduated last semester have. It's not something that the people who necessarily graduate next semester have. This is a really unique, strange situation that most people are down on, but you might be able to turn that lemon into some lemonade for, starting your career.
I think it's a powerful message that you delivered to that group. And quite frankly, the mindset of a student teacher is sometimes can be just to get through the things that you need to get through in order to gain access to the workforce, right? Or to schools. You need the certificate, you need to pass the tests, you need right. So that occupies a great space in your head. What you're not thinking about, or maybe have blinders onto, is how am I going to tell the story about what it was like to teach this way, and how does it benefit you and your school district? And that's just a powerful message that you delivered there. Yeah, really, really powerful. Good for you.
Well, even too, if they did that, I mean, talk about building a relationship with the teachers in that building, especially if the administration sees it, like, oh, what are these videos here? Like, oh, my student teacher, like, oh, wow, this person is, look at what, I mean, there's a whole learning curve to being able to make videos that most teachers might not have had, especially if they're able to make it in a compelling way. And there's a lot of value in that. And I think, one thing that we've talked about too is I think a lot, I'm not talking about on behalf of our district here, but I think overall, like in our country, a lot of PD for schools will be on virtual teaching, teaching virtually, because it's because even if we do go back to a more traditional classroom, I think there's so much value in learning how to do that you can even apply to your direct classroom work as well. So yeah.
That's a great point. I actually started working on a PD recently, and it's hard being in my role because I don't have a classroom set of kids. So a lot of what I'm trying to gather is how to support teachers during this time. And one of the PDs that I just started to create was basically, how do we create vibrant virtual communities? And so that's the title of the PD. And I started creating these slides and questions we can ask ourselves, and mock-ups of schedules and ways that it might go. And I think you're right. I'm trying to prepare in a way that I support teachers through this process to isolate the things that are essential and tease out the things that are non-essential. Like making a compelling video seems like an essential task. Grading X amount of Google Forms. I don't know how essential that might be, but giving feedback on questions asked and the student responses, essential. So I think it's just teasing out what's going to be essential, what's not going to be essential. But to your point, I think this is a new frontier.
Learning of teaching virtually that we have, when I was thinking about this yesterday, this past year, Brian, we may have had our last snow day ever.
Good point.
Right?
It's a great point.
Next year, if we have a snow day, guess what it probably is? It's a virtual teaching day.
It's virtual teaching. Yeah, that's a great point. Wow.
We had our last snow day this year, probably. Like, again, just to think about, like, because it's not like, and another thing too, and with how education is probably going to change, education somewhat has changed always slowly, because it's hard to do big changes with things with our country. But this is not being changed because of output or quality. This is being changed because the process has to change. Not because of anything that anyone did, but it's the cards we are dealt now, and we have to figure out how to continue educating people, without being in the same room. Even if we do go back to it, it's going to be because at bare minimum, even not for us, but for our students, because that's how they're going to be probably working in the future, is virtually, depending on the career they go into.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to tease out the essentials from the non-essentials right now. And like you said, carve out a path for what does that mean? Now, I know our field, and I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, is our field of educators is the same field that with 24 hours notice on a Friday, by Monday, we had a ton of material put out there. I interviewed Mike Drezick, and one of the things that he said was it was basically like standing in front of the fire hose.
Yeah,
the amount of resources,
it was perfect.
Yeah, the amount of resources that came out just continue. But here's the thing: no one turned down the valve, right? Like there's just a constant flow, and it's not even the volume of resources is still out there. So I guess that's my point is you're going to see people who take this opportunity, see it for what it is, feel like they have to do, 10x what it is they were doing before. I guess what advice would you have for teachers who are navigating? Like, what would you recommend they get comfortable with in this environment?
I think right now the most important thing, and I don't say this lightly, is almost for teachers' mental health, is to not compare themselves to what other teachers are doing.
Oh, that's such an important message.
It's easier to not do that in the classroom because you're in your own room. You might hear about a lesson that someone else does. Maybe you walk by, see something, but for the most part, you kind of are only focused on your own classroom. Whereas when it's virtual, it's kind of there for everyone to see, or at least everyone in your school to see. And it's very easy to compare yourself to people, which is, first of all, it does nothing really to help you. And I think it just can put people in a non-productive mindset. And because it just, because people have different skills. Again, me as someone who is enjoys and competent in video editing, my lessons are going to look different.
Yeah.
Some people that are doing worksheets and slideshows for their kids are they're maybe not I think we were talking about this, not comfortable with them having themselves in it, so they do the bit emojis. Like, everyone's going to kind of come at it at their own way, but I'd also encourage them to experiment and be willing to take a chance with doing something new, being vulnerable with this new teaching process that we're all going through.
I love that you said that. I think that's actually got to be like, I have to adopt exactly what you just said there, which is I've got to make sure that people feel comfortable doing what it is they feel like they need to do in order to engage kids. But I also have to be accountable to pushing them enough to say, listen, this doesn't have to be the only way you do it. We can experiment here a little bit, because the reality is all kids will show back up. I say this often to teach, like, you could fail. You could have a really good plan for a lesson, and that lesson can flop in front of kids when you're live with them. And guess what? They all show up tomorrow. And there's no hard feelings. They're not mad at you. They're not mad that it didn't go the way that it.
They're not going to unsubscribe.
They're not going to unsubscribe to your classroom. They will be there on Tuesday. And the same thing, I think, applies when you talk about digital communities. Like, you're not going to lose subscriber count. If your subscriber count, your classroom in this case, is 22 kids, right? You have 22 on a virtual call on a Wednesday. If you're experimenting with something and you fumble over the tech, or it doesn't quite go the way that you wanted it to, or your video isn't, polished or published the way that you think it ought to be, don't compare yourself to anybody. Just understand that your kids will show up. The more you continue to push at that thing, the better you will become.
Yeah.
I think that's a great message.
Yeah, and one more thing I just tag on to that too.
Yeah.
Which is harder. If other people are comparing you to someone, you have to ignore that too. And hopefully that's not happening. But I think that's where it kind of can hurt the most. If you feel like other people are comparing you. And just to respond to that fire hose that you mentioned of content that people started producing right away, I feel like a lot of that wasn't, I think, there's multiple hats, that you can, or buckets you can fill at once. There's not always just one bucket. And I do think a lot of those people were trying to create great content for their kids and for students in general. But I think a lot of them are just trying to show to their administration and to their school that look, I'm doing something, and I don't think that's the reason to do it. In a way, that is important to show that you are contributing, but that shouldn't be why you're doing it. It should always be student first, and make sure what you're doing is actually valuable to the kids, not just so people can see that you're working. Making sure of that, because again, a lot of the other art lessons I saw people releasing at that time were drawing lessons and painting lessons. And again, like, I realized I didn't have paper at my own house. How can I expect my kids to have paper? Now, hopefully at this point, people have some basic supplies after almost 3 months now. But again, at week 1, I didn't have any of that myself. So that's why I was doing stuff out of laundry and out of books, stacking books and things that you would literally just have around the house.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think other people were just trying to show that they were doing something, which again, and if they were using that as a learning experience or how to create content too, that's fine too. Because again, it's just also new for everyone. It's just, there was a lot to think about in the beginning.
There sure was. And I think, your point about designing lessons for kids with bigger buckets in mind, I think is an important one. If I want kids to engage creatively and critically with anything, then my design elements might not be the medium of, acrylic paints and, watercolors, right? Like it just might not be that way. And I can't guarantee that those things are on hand. But what I can guarantee is on hand is perhaps laundry or cereal boxes or, So I think your point and your lessons that you put out, and those were on, I think on Facebook, you put some of those interesting things out, you put some things out on YouTube, but I think those really hit home with families because it signaled, hey, look, in order to be a creator, you don't need pen and pad per se. I can help you be a creator with things that are on hand. And I think that was a message that folks got. And that's probably why you had so much attention around those things. I mean, you just put that out as like a normal Adam Kreutinger video.
Yeah.
And it really popped for a lot of people.
And one thing that I learned in doing that, which I didn't expect to learn too, is in the art class, when I have all the material set up and I do my example, no matter how much I try to inspire the kids to do their own design, a lot of times it ends up looking similar to mine. And part of the reason for that is we're all using the same size piece of paper. We're all using the same art supplies. We have the same exact shades of paint. But whereas, like, for example, with that laundry one, like I had a blue towel. I had, bigger, not kid-sized clothes. I had my own personal. So
Right.
but by just the nature of the items I had, they couldn't make it just like mine, even if they
Sure.
wanted to. So it kind of forced creative thinking on them that's a little harder to do in the traditional classroom setting.
Yeah. And, I'm just going to piggyback off of that because, again, going back to the art of writing. Okay. And this is one of the things that I have to caution colleagues against is when you go to demonstrate your writing in front of kids. Okay. If you are telling a story, okay, if we're talking about the genre of narrative writing and you tell the story of the time your dog got loose. Okay. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, I can guarantee you at least 25% of your room is going to write about a dog that got lost. Okay. Or the time that Fluffy got off the leash. The other 25% of your room is going to write about a dog. Okay. Like they're all going to be like shades of the thing that you wrote. And what happens a lot of times is you kind of push kids down a path to create something that they weren't really thinking of. And that's not the goal of teaching writing that way. The goal of teaching writing that way is for you to have an idea that's compelling and to push that idea down on the page and have others react to it or keep it yourself or whatever. And so I just think that's such an important thing is to say, what are the ways that I could create that others aren't necessarily going to feel like they have to replicate? And sometimes that mimicking or that mirroring a good writer or a good art teacher or design is a good thing because it gives you the rep at finding your comfort with it. But other times it's not what I want from a design element. And I just think it's just something to be sort of aware of is like, how do I free kids up to make decisions on their own, have some voice and choice over the content? Well, hey, listen, I wanted to wrap this up by asking you a couple questions that I think can span education, but could certainly span, creativity or being a creator or a thinker. And so if you could just break these things down for me, what is one thing that you have changed your mind about, perhaps say, let's over the last like 5 years, maybe something you were really thinking about that was a big item for you or that you're like, you know what, now I'm having second thoughts that might not be the way that it is. It's one question I have. And then the other question is there a book that has been influential for you and the things that you're doing today that you've read over the last year? And you can answer them in any order.
Sure, sure. I don't know about something that I've changed my mind about. I think
Could be
what I
anything.
would, yeah, one thing I just would say is I don't with anything that I think, it's always kind of fluid. It's with the information that I have at the time.
Mhm.
So I change my mind all the time based on the information I have
Hmm.
at the moment. So I don't think of it as so much as changing my mind, it's just as it is being open-minded
Hmm.
to the reality of situations, whatever they are. And again, just to put it in context of what's going on now, like when this first pandemic started, there was very little information about this virus. We didn't know what it was, and I think we were um the people are saying at first masks don't work, and then that's what I thought, because that's what the CDC was saying, and then they get more information like, oh, masks do work, you should wear masks. So again, like I can um I base everything that I know based on what I know at the time.
Great point.
I keep
That's
it
a
all
great
fluid.
answer.
But for as far as books, a book that I read this past year that really inspired me a lot was Becoming Dr. Seuss.
Okay.
It's called. It's a biography written by Brian J. Jones,
Mhm.
and it was just kind of followed his life and where he started and where he came from, and uh it was just so inspiring just to hear those types of stories. Actually, he's written a couple different ones. He's done one on Jim Henson, which I liked a lot,
Mm.
and I've started getting into writing children's books as well and illustrating. So I found a lot of inspiration in this, especially in that he kind of reinvented the genre of children's books, which was really inspiring to me. But
Mhm.
he almost didn't do it. He didn't do it on purpose either. He just did it by being himself,
Hmm.
um, which is something you can't replicate. You just have to be yourself, and then hopefully that will resonate with people. And that's what I try to uh, do with everything that I do. I think is I'm unapologetically me,
Mhm. Mm.
with my flaws and my positive attributes as well. And you might like it, you might not like it,
Mhm.
but that's what you see is what you get.
That's a great way. I love that. That's a great place to end. Um, where can people find you besides everywhere? But what are the main hubs that people can get in contact with you? And one of the things that we didn't even touch on was the community engagement you get and the care you have for people who leave you comments. I know you try to get to every single comment that you possibly can on all of your platforms. But where could people engage with you a little bit more if they want to find out a little bit more about your sort of podcasts, perhaps the puppetry, your work as an educator? I know you have family shows that you're doing too.
Mm.
Where can they connect with you?
Yeah, like you said, I'm kind of everywhere. They can, and I do pay attention to all of them. It can Twitter, it's all the same handle at Adam Kreutinger.
Okay.
Um, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Facebook, it's actually at Kreutinger Puppets. That's my page if you want to see puppet stuff. If you go to any of those, you'll get some puppet stuff. But if you want stuff with the most variety of my work, it'd probably be Twitter. Secondly to that would be Instagram, and then Kreutinger Puppets on Facebook is Kreutinger Puppets. So get ready for puppets if you that's what you like.
Fantastic. That is really good. Perfect. All right, my friend. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time and your commitment to this hour-long podcast and pushing me to be a better version of myself. Thank you.
My pleasure, bud. Great.
All right. So there is my conversation with Adam Kreutinger. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to hear more about Adam, I will put information in the notes below. If you want to connect with me, I will put my information in the notes below too. Thank you so much for watching. This has been People Who Teach.